In 2019, a team of physicists at Heriot-Watt University in Edinburgh built a machine to answer a question that had haunted quantum mechanics for nearly a century. The question was simple: what counts as an observer? What is the minimum requirement for something to collapse, a quantum superposition, to force a particle to stop being in two states at once? And pick one. Does it have to be a human being? Does it require consciousness, a brain, some spark of awareness? Or could something simpler do the job? The team was led by Alessandro Fedrizzi, an Italian experimentalist who had trained with Anton Zeilinger in Vienna. The lead author was Massimiliano Proietti, a young researcher who had designed the intricate photonic circuits that made the experiment possible. They worked in a basement laboratory in Edinburgh, surrounded by lasers and mirrors and beam splitters, building a machine to test whether reality was observer independent. They used 6 entangled photons, particles of light, and they set up a scenario where the photon itself would act as the observer, not a human looking at a screen, not a conscious mind processing information, a single particle of light interacting with another particle of light in a carefully controlled laboratory setting. The experiment was a realization of a thought experiment that had been proposed decades earlier by the Austrian physicist Kaslav Bruckner. Bruckner, working at the University of Vienna, had combined the original Wigner's friend scenario with Bell-type inequalities to create a testable prediction. If observer-independent facts exist, certain statistical correlations should be bounded. If they do not, the bounds could be violated. The experiment worked. The photon collapsed the superposition. It observed. And then the paper was published in Science Advances in September of that year, one of the most respected journals in physics. It was peer-reviewed, verified, cited by dozens of subsequent papers, and then it was quietly set aside. Because what the team actually proved was not just that photons can observe. That part, honestly, most physicists already suspected. What they proved was something far more uncomfortable. They showed that if you take quantum mechanics seriously, if you apply it consistently to everything including the observers themselves, then different observers can get different answers about the same event. Not because one of them made an error, not because their equipment was faulty, but because according to the math, there may be no fact of the matter that exists independently of who is asking. Think about that for a moment. You and I could both observe the same quantum system, both follow the rules of physics perfectly, and arrive at contradictory conclusions. And quantum mechanics says we would both be right. There is no tiebreaker. There is no ultimate truth waiting behind the curtain. There is just your perspective and my perspective, and they do not have to match. This should have been front-page news. It should have sparked a revolution in how we think about reality. Instead, it earned a few articles in science magazines, some discussion in specialist journals, and then the physics community moved on. Because the implications are too strange, too destabilizing, too uncomfortable to sit with. You were taught a story about quantum mechanics. The popular version, the one that shows up in documentaries and YouTube videos and books with titles about parallel universes. In that story, observation is special. Consciousness is special. When a human being looks at a quantum system, something magical happens. The wave function collapses. Possibility becomes actuality. You, the observer, are the catalyst that makes reality real. That story is wrong. Not partially wrong. not an oversimplification. It is a misunderstanding that has been experimentally disproven for decades. The consciousness interpretation of quantum mechanics, the idea that human awareness is necessary to collapse wave functions, has been effectively dead among working physicists. Since at least the 1980s, experiments have confirmed over and over that electronic detectors collapse wave functions. Individual electrons collapse wave functions. Air molecules collapse wave functions. Photons collapse wave functions. None of these things are conscious. None of them have minds. And all of them perform observation just as effectively as a Nobel laureate staring at a screen. But here is what the popular story does not tell you. In killing the consciousness interpretation, physics opened a door to something worse. Because if observation does not require consciousness, then what does it require? The answer, according to decoherence theory and its extension quantum Darwinism, is almost nothing. Any interaction that transfers information counts. Any correlation between systems counts. The environment is constantly observing everything, all the time, through every scattered photon, and every colliding molecule, and every vibration of every atom. And if that is true, then observation is not a special event that humans perform. It is the fundamental process by which reality constitutes itself. Every particle is observing every other particle. Every interaction is a measurement. The universe is not a stage on which observers watch. It is a web of mutual observation, with no outside, no objective view, no single truth that exists independent of perspective. The 2019 experiment was not the first hint of this. It was the confirmation, the point of no return. And the question it forced into the open is one that most physicists would rather not answer. What happens to reality when everything is an observer? To understand how physics arrived at this question, you have to go back to the moment when the problem was accidentally created, 1932. A book called Mathematical Foundations of Quantum Mechanics. The author was a Hungarian mathematician named John von Neumann, and by the accounts of everyone who knew him, he was the closest thing to superhuman intelligence that 20th century science ever produced. Von Neumann was a child prodigy who could divide 8-digit numbers in his head at age 6. By age 8, he was familiar with differential and integral calculus. At parties, he would memorize pages from phone books and recite them back as a trick. He could recall entire novels in perfect detail, decades after reading them. Edward Teller, the father of the hydrogen bomb, said that von Neumann's brain indicated a species superior to humans. Hans Bethe, another Manhattan Project physicist, said he sometimes wondered whether von Neumann's brain represented a new step in human evolution. He was born into a wealthy Jewish family in Budapest on December 28, 1903. His father, Max, was a banker who purchased a noble title, which is why John was formerly Janos von Neumann. The family lived in an 18-room apartment on the top floor of a building that housed the Can Heller Company, his father's business. He attended the Fossori Gymnasium in Budapest, one of the most elite schools in Europe, where his classmate was another future physics legend named Eugene Wigner. The school was a factory for geniuses. The mathematics teacher, Laszlo Ratz, recognized exceptional students and gave them private tutoring. Von Neumann and Wigner both received this attention. Both would go on to revolutionize physics. Both would work on the atomic bomb. Both would grapple with the measurement problem that von Neumann accidentally created Von Neumann received his PhD in mathematics at age 22, simultaneously earning a degree in chemical engineering because his father insisted on something practical. He became the youngest permanent member of the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton at age 30, earning a salary of $10,000 a year, an enormous sum during the Depression. He helped design the implosion mechanism for the plutonium bomb. He invented game theory with his book Theory of Games and Economic Behavior in 1944. He laid the foundations for computer architecture with what is now called the von Neumann architecture in 1945. He calculated the optimal altitude for detonating atomic bombs over cities to maximize destruction. And in 1932, almost as an afterthought, he wrote the book that would define the mathematical structure of quantum mechanics for the next century. In Chapter 6, von Neumann identified something troubling. Quantum mechanics has two different rules for how systems evolve. The first rule is the Schrödinger equation, which describes how quantum states change continuously over time. It is smooth, deterministic, reversible. A superposition stays a superposition. An electron that is in two places at once remains in two places at once forever, as long as this rule applies. The second rule is collapse. When a measurement happens, the superposition ends. The electron is no longer in two places. It is in one place. The wave function has collapsed. This process is discontinuous, probabilistic, and irreversible. It breaks the smooth flow of the Schrödinger equation. Von Neumann asked the obvious question: when exactly does collapse happen? At what point in the measurement process does the first rule stop applying and the second rule take over? His answer was disturbing. He traced the chain of physical interactions that occurs during a measurement. A quantum system interacts with a detector. The detector becomes correlated with the system. Now the detector is in a superposition too. The detector interacts with the display. The display becomes correlated with the detector. Now the display is in a superposition. The display emits light that enters an observer's eyes. The eyes become correlated with the display. The eyes send signals to the brain. The brain becomes correlated with the eyes. At each stage, the superposition spreads. Nothing in the physics forces a collapse. The Schrödinger equation just keeps doing its thing, entangling more and more systems together. Von Neumann demonstrated mathematically that you could place the collapse anywhere along this chain without changing the predictions. You could say the detector caused the collapse, or the display, or the eyes, or the brain, or something even further down the line. The math does not care. It gives the same answers regardless. And then von Neumann wrote a sentence that would echo through decades of debate. He said that the collapse can only occur in the observer's consciousness. Now, recent scholarship has argued that von Neumann did not mean this as a metaphysical claim. He may have been making a purely logical observation about where the chain has to terminate, if you want to avoid infinite regress. But the words were on the page. And in 1939, two physicists named Fritz London and Edmund Bauer pushed the interpretation further, arguing explicitly that consciousness completes the measurement process. And then, in 1961, von Neumann's old schoolmate Eugene Wigner kicked the door wide open. By 1961, Wigner was a towering figure in physics. He would win the Nobel Prize 2 years later for his work on symmetry principles. He had worked on the Manhattan Project at the University of Chicago's Metallurgical Laboratory, where he designed the nuclear reactors that produced the plutonium for the Trinity test and the Nagasaki bomb. He was as establishment gets, and in an essay called Remarks on the Mind-Body Question, he argued that consciousness must play a special role in quantum mechanics. His reasoning was elegant. He had a thought experiment. Wigner was an unusual man. Born in Budapest on November 17, 1902, just a year before von Neumann, he was shy, polite, and utterly devoted to physics. His nickname was the Silent Genius because he spoke so rarely and so quietly. When he did speak, people leaned in. What he said was always worth hearing. He had trained as a chemical engineer, like von Neumann, because his father did not believe pure mathematics or physics could provide a living. But his passion was always for fundamental questions. In 1931, he published a book on group theory and quantum mechanics that became foundational. The mathematical framework he developed, using the symmetries of physical systems to derive their properties, remains central to theoretical physics today. Later in life, Wigner developed a deep interest in Vedanta philosophy, the Hindu tradition that holds that consciousness is fundamental to reality. Some scholars believe this influenced his views on quantum mechanics. He wrote that it was not possible to formulate the laws of quantum mechanics in a fully consistent way without reference to consciousness. And he went further. All that quantum mechanics purports to provide, he argued, are probability connections between subsequent impressions of the consciousness. When he first proposed Wigner's friend, the thought experiment seemed to support the idea that consciousness was special. Imagine a friend in a sealed laboratory performing a quantum measurement. From the friend's perspective, the measurement happens. The wave function collapses. The friend sees a definite result. But from Wigner's perspective, outside the laboratory, the entire system, including the friend, remains in superposition. According to the Schrödinger equation, the friend is now entangled with the quantum system, correlated with both possible outcomes simultaneously. So when does the collapse actually occur? When the friend looks at the result, or when Wigner opens the laboratory and asks what happened? Wigner's conclusion was that the contradiction could only be resolved if conscious observation causes collapse. Linear quantum evolution, he argued, cannot apply when the physical entity involved is a conscious being. Something about consciousness breaks the chain. This is where the popular story usually stops. Consciousness is special. Observation creates reality. The universe needs you. But Wigner did not stop there. He kept thinking about it. He kept worrying about it. And by the late 1970s, he had changed his mind. What changed him was a paper published in 1970 by an obscure German physicist named H. Dieter Zeh. The paper was called On the Interpretation of Measurement in Quantum Theory, and for more than a decade, almost nobody paid attention to it. Zeh himself described the 1970s as the dark ages of decoherence. His ideas were ignored, dismissed, or met with hostility. But Wigner read the paper, and what Zeh proposed was that wave function collapse could be understood without invoking consciousness at all. The key was the environment. A quantum system is never truly isolated. Even in the most carefully controlled experiment, there are stray photons, thermal vibrations, electromagnetic fields. The system interacts with its surroundings, And when it does, it becomes entangled with them. The superposition does not disappear exactly. It spreads out into the environment, becoming correlated with so many particles that the interference effects, the signature of quantum behavior, become effectively undetectable. This is decoherence. The environment, simply by interacting with a quantum system, destroys the observable signatures of superposition, not because consciousness intervened, not because a measurement occurred in any philosophically significant sense, just because particles bumped into other particles and information leaked out into the world. By 1982, Wigner was publicly criticizing his own earlier view. He called it something that should be criticized as solipsism. By 1984, he said he had been convinced out of it by Zay's work. The man who had made consciousness central to quantum mechanics had abandoned the idea. But here is the thing nobody talks about. In solving the problem of consciousness, decoherence opened a new problem. If the environment can cause collapse, or at least the appearance of collapse, then observation is not rare. The environment is everywhere. The environment is always interacting with everything. The universe is soaked in observation, and that means the question of what happens when observers observe each other becomes urgent, not just as a thought experiment, as a real physical question with real experimental consequences. A physicist named Wojciech Zurek spent the 1980s and 90s turning decoherence from a philosophical idea into a rigorous research program. Zurek was born in Bielsko-Biała, Poland, in 1951, grew up under communist rule, and managed to get out to the University of Texas for his PhD. He was a postdoctoral fellow with John Wheeler, one of the most creative physicists of the 20th century, and eventually landed at Los Alamos National Laboratory, where he has been a laboratory fellow since 1996. Zurek asked a question that decoherence on its own could not answer. If the environment is constantly monitoring quantum systems, destroying superpositions left and right, why do certain states survive and others do not? Why does your coffee cup always appear in a definite position, never smeared across the kitchen? The Schrödinger equation does not privilege any particular set of states, so where does the preference come from? His answer was a process he called einselection, for environment-induced superselection. The environment does not just destroy superpositions randomly. It selects for particular states the ones that are robust against environmental monitoring. Zurek called these pointer states. They are the states that, when the environment interacts with a system, remain stable. Other states, superpositions of pointer states, get rapidly entangled with the environment and lose their coherence. The pointer states survive. This explains why we see objects in definite positions rather than smeared out superpositions. Position states for macroscopic objects are pointer states. They are robust against environmental decoherence. Superpositions of position are not. They collapse or appear to collapse almost instantaneously. But Zurek went further. In 2009, he published a paper in Nature Physics introducing a concept he called Quantum Darwinism. The idea is this: when the environment interacts with a system, it does not just destroy coherence, it also acquires information about the system's state. Scattered photons carry information. Displaced air molecules carry information. The environment becomes a kind of witness, recording what state the system is in. And here is the key insight. The environment does not just record this information once. It records it redundantly in many independent fragments. When you look at your coffee cup, you are not receiving information directly from the cup. You are receiving information from photons that scattered off the cup and entered your eyes. Those photons are just one tiny fragment of the environment that has recorded the cup's position. Other photons scattered in other directions. Air molecules bounced off the cup. Thermal radiation was emitted. Each of these fragments contains a copy of the information about where the cup is. Zurek described it vividly. The environment, he said, is like a big advertising billboard, which floats multiple copies of the information about our universe all over the place. We almost never do any direct measurement on anything. We look at the copies. This is how classical reality emerges from quantum mechanics. The states that get copied into the environment, the ones that leave redundant records everywhere, are the ones we perceive as real. They are the ones we can all agree on, because we are all reading from the same distributed record. Pointer states are the fittest states in a Darwinian sense. They survive environmental monitoring. They leave descendants copies of themselves imprinted on the environment. Other states do not survive. They are selected out. The experimental confirmation of these ideas has been building for decades. In 1996, a team led by Serge Haroche at the École Normale Supérieure in Paris created a mesoscopic superposition state in a microwave cavity and watched decoherence unfold in real time. They could see the interference fringes fade as the system interacted with its environment. Zurek later said that this experiment marked the beginning of the exploration of the weird and mysterious transition from quantum to classical. The Haroche experiment was a technical tour de force. The team used atoms as probes of a coherent state of microwave photons trapped in a cavity made of superconducting mirrors. The cavity was so precisely engineered that photons could bounce back and forth for over a tenth of a second before escaping, an eternity in quantum terms. The atoms, prepared in special superposition states, passed through the cavity one by one, each one interacting briefly with the photon field and then flying onto a detector. By sending atoms through at precisely timed intervals, the team could track how the quantum coherence of the photon field decayed. They watched the interference pattern fade over the course of milliseconds. The larger the initial superposition, the faster it collapsed. This was decoherence in action, exactly as the theory predicted. The environment was destroying the quantum nature of the superposition, not by any magical process, but simply by leaking information out of the system. Stray photons escaping the cavity carried away information about the state. That was all it took. No consciousness, no measurement apparatus in the traditional sense, just information leaking into the wider world. Haroche won the Nobel Prize in 2012, in part for this work, shared with David Wineland. The Nobel Committee cited their development of methods to measure and manipulate individual quantum systems. Decoherence had gone from a theoretical proposal ignored for decades to Nobel Prize-winning experimental physics. In 1998, at the Weizmann Institute in Israel, a team led by Mordechai Heiblum built a device smaller than 1 micron and showed that an electronic detector, not a human observer, could collapse the wave function of electrons passing through a barrier. The detector was a tiny sensor, and its sensitivity could be tuned. The result was striking. The more the detector could observe, the more the interference pattern disappeared. This was not a conscious observer. It was a piece of equipment, and it worked exactly as decoherence theory predicted. In 2007, a team at Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory used the two protons in a hydrogen molecule as a double slit. When an X-ray photon ejected both electrons, one slow electron acted as an observer of the fast electron's path. The slow electron, not a human, collapsed the fast electron's interference pattern. The lead researcher, Ali Belkacem, said the bad news is that decoherence and loss of information occur on the very tiny scale of a single hydrogen molecule. 3 independent experiments in 2018 and 2019 confirmed specific predictions of quantum Darwinism using photonic systems, quantum simulators, and nitrogen vacancy centers in diamond. In 2005, a team using 12 superconducting qubits provided what Zurek called the most comprehensive verification of quantum Darwinism to date. So the picture that emerges is this: the environment is constantly observing everything, not because it has consciousness or intention, just because particles interact and interactions transfer information. The reason you see definite classical reality is not because your consciousness collapses wave functions. It is because the environment has already done the work. The information about pointer states has been copied into countless fragments of the environment. You are just reading the record. This should settle the matter. The environment observes. Consciousness is irrelevant. Decoherence explains why we do not see superpositions in everyday life. Quantum Darwinism explains why we all agree on what is real. The measurement problem is solved, at least for practical purposes. But there is a catch. Decoherence explains why interference disappears. It does not explain why one specific outcome occurs rather than another. The wave function, mathematically speaking, does not actually collapse. It just spreads out, entangling with more and more environmental degrees of freedom. The different outcomes are still there, in some sense encoded in the correlations between the system and its environment. Decoherence gives you the appearance of collapse without the metaphysics. And this raises a question that decoherence cannot answer on its own. What happens when you have two observers, both applying quantum mechanics, trying to describe each other? If the wave function never really collapses, just spreads out, then observer A describing observer B should still see B in a superposition, and observer B describing observer A should see A in a superposition. And when they compare notes, what happens? The math gets strange here. Strange enough that most physicists would rather not think about it. But in 2018, a T.H. Zurek decided to think about it anyway. Daniela Frauschiger and Renato Renner published their paper in Nature Communications in September of 2018. The title was blunt: Quantum theory cannot consistently describe the use of itself. Their thought experiment involves 4 agents. Call them Alice, Bob, and their 2 friends. Each agent can perform quantum measurements. Each agent can use quantum mechanics to reason about what the other agents will observe. And when you work through the logic carefully, you reach a contradiction. The details are technical, but the upshot is this: if quantum mechanics is universally valid, applying to observers just as it applies to electrons, then at least one of 3 assumptions must be wrong. Either quantum predictions are not always correct, or logical reasoning can fail, or measurements do not have single definite outcomes. Renner, one of the authors, said that the science stops there. We just know one of the 3 is wrong, and we cannot really give a good argument as to which one is violated. This is now a matter of interpretation and taste. He also noted that some of his colleagues reacted very emotionally to the findings. This was a thought experiment, but the following year, the Heriot-Watt team turned it into a real experiment. Their setup used 6 entangled photons, generated through a process called parametric down conversion. The experiment realized an extended version of Wigner's original thought experiment, but with a crucial twist. Instead of just one Wigner and one friend, they had 2 pairs, 2 Wigners on the outside, 2 friends on the inside. And the friends were not humans, they were photons. Now, critics would later point out that a photon is not a very good stand-in for a conscious observer. Lev Vaidman at Tel Aviv University called it ridiculous. Tim Maudlin at NYU said nobody thinks a photon is an observer. But the team was not claiming that photons are conscious. They were testing a more minimal assumption. What if an observer is just any physical system that can extract information from another system by means of some interaction and store that information in a physical memory? A photon interacting with another photon and becoming correlated with its state fits that definition. It is the most stripped-down possible version of observation. No consciousness, no complexity, just correlation. The experiment tested something called a Bell-type inequality, but adapted for this scenario. The inequality was derived from an assumption the team called local observer independence. This assumption has 3 parts. First, that universal facts exist and observers can agree on them. Second, that observers have freedom to make whatever observations they want. Third, that choices one observer makes do not influence distant observers, locality. If all 3 assumptions are true, then the inequality should hold. The experimental results should stay within certain bounds. They did not. The team violated the inequality by 5 standard deviations. That is the gold standard for a confirmed result in physics. The probability of this happening by chance is less than 1 in a million. The paper's conclusion was stark. If one holds fast to the assumptions of locality and free choice, this result implies that quantum theory should be interpreted in an observer-dependent way. In other words, if you want to keep believing that your choices are free and that distant events cannot influence each other faster than light, then you have to give up on the idea that observed facts are universal. Different observers can have different facts, and there is no contradiction, because there is no observer-independent truth to contradict. Alessandro Fedrizzi, the lab leader, put it this way: the insight we gained is that quantum observers may indeed be entitled to their own facts. 1 year later, a team at Griffith University in Australia extended these results. Their paper, published in Nature Physics in 2020, introduced something they called local friendliness inequalities. These are even stronger than Bell inequalities. They can be violated even in situations where Bell inequalities cannot. The Griffith team identified 3 assumptions that together form what they called local friendliness. First, the absoluteness of observed events. Every observed event exists absolutely, not just relative to the observer. Second, locality. Third, no superdeterminism. Observers have genuine freedom in their choices. They proved mathematically that these 3 assumptions cannot all be true. If quantum evolution is controllable on the scale of an observer. Howard Wiseman, one of the lead researchers, said the key for future experiments will be scaling up the size of the friend. The most dramatic result would involve using an artificial intelligence embodied on a quantum computer as the friend. If you could put an AI in superposition and then check whether its observations are absolute or relative, you would have a definitive test of whether there is anything special about consciousness or whether any sufficiently complex information processing system counts as an observer. In 2003, all three of these foundational papers, Frauchiger-Renner, Heriot-Watt, and Bohm et al., were jointly awarded the Paul Ehrenfest Best Paper Award for Quantum Foundations. The award committee said these theorems provide new challenges for the interpretation of quantum theory, forcing us to make some hard choices in our conception of quantum reality. But making hard choices is exactly what the physics community has historically refused to do. And to understand why, you have to understand what happened to the people who tried. The phrase that defines the culture of modern physics was coined in 1989 by N. David Neumann, a physicist at Cornell University. He was writing a column for Physics Today, and he was trying to capture the attitude that had dominated quantum mechanics for decades. If I were forced to sum up in one sentence what the Copenhagen interpretation says to me, he wrote, it would be shut up and calculate. The phrase is often attributed to Richard Feynman, but Feynman never said it. Mermin confirmed this in a follow-up column 15 years later, titled, Could Feynman Have Said This? He traced the misattribution and explained where the sentiment really came from. When he was a graduate student at Harvard in the late 1950s, asking questions about what quantum mechanics meant, his advisors told him, "You will never get a PhD if you allow yourself to be distracted by such frivolities. Get back to serious business and produce some results. Shut up, in other words, and calculate." This attitude did not emerge spontaneously. It was enforced. The enforcers were the giants of 20th century physics, the founders of quantum mechanics themselves. Niels Bohr cast a long shadow. His institute in Copenhagen was the center of the quantum world, and his view of the theory, however ambiguous and philosophically murky, was treated as gospel. To question the Copenhagen interpretation was to question Bohr, and questioning Bohr could cost you your career. The people who refused to shut up paid for it with their careers. David Bohm received his PhD from UC Berkeley in 1943, working under Robert Oppenheimer. His thesis on plasma physics was so immediately relevant to the Manhattan Project that it was classified before Bohm could defend it. He was not allowed to read his own work. Oppenheimer had to certify that he had completed the degree because Bohm could not access the documents to prepare for his defense. After the war, Bohm took a position at Princeton. He was a brilliant lecturer. Albert Einstein attended his course on quantum mechanics and came away impressed. In 1951, Bohm published a textbook on quantum theory that Einstein praised as the clearest treatment he had seen. The same year, he published 2 papers proposing his pilot wave interpretation. In Bohmian mechanics, particles have definite positions at all times. There is no superposition of positions for a particle. The wave function exists, but it guides the particle's motion like a pilot wave, rather than representing a probability distribution that collapses upon measurement. There is no measurement problem because there is no collapse. The particle was always somewhere. We just did not know where until we looked. This interpretation gives the same predictions as standard quantum mechanics. It cannot be experimentally distinguished from Copenhagen, but it offers a clear picture of what is happening, a picture that eliminates the mysterious role of the observer. The physics establishment hated it. Niels Bohr called it very foolish. Wolfgang Pauli dismissed it as metaphysical. Leon Rosenfeld, Bohr's close ally, attacked it viciously. J. Robert Oppenheimer, Bohm's former thesis advisor, the man who had helped him get through his own PhD defense, called it juvenile deviationism. Einstein, who you might think would welcome an interpretation that restored determinism and eliminated observer dependence, called it a physical fairy tale for children, although he acknowledged the logical consistency of the approach. But Bohm's troubles went far beyond academic criticism. In 1949, he was called before the House Committee on Un-American Activities. He had been a member of Communist Party meetings as a graduate student at Berkeley in the late 1930s. The reasons were partly political, partly social. Several of his friends were members. The physics graduate student community at Berkeley was left-leaning. Bohm later said he had attended a few meetings, found them boring, and drifted away. This did not satisfy Hugh. Bohm pleaded the Fifth Amendment, refusing to name names. He was indicted for contempt of Congress. He was arrested and jailed until he could post bail. The charges were eventually dismissed, but the damage was done. Princeton did not renew his contract. In June of 1951, Bohm was banned from the Princeton campus. He could not even enter the building where he had taught. His requests for security clearance were denied. His passport was revoked. He could not leave the country, but he could not work within it either. Einstein helped him find a position in Sao Paulo, Brazil. When his passport was finally restored, Bohm moved to Israel, then to Bristol in England, and finally to Birkbeck College in London, where he spent the last 26 years of his career. He never returned to the United States to work. His interpretation was not just criticized, it was ignored. For roughly 30 years, the physics community acted as if pilot wave theory did not exist. It was not taught. It was not discussed. Papers on quantum foundations were routinely rejected from major journals, with comments suggesting that the questions being asked were not real physics. The questions Bohm was asking were considered not just wrong, but improper, not just mistaken, but professionally disqualifying. Hugh Everett had it even worse. He was born on November 11, 1930, in Washington, D.C. His father, also named Hugh, was a military officer who spent much of his career away from the family. His parents divorced when Hugh was young. He was raised largely by his mother, Catherine, who worked as a government secretary. Everett showed early signs of brilliance and eccentricity. At age 12, he wrote a letter to Albert Einstein asking about the nature of the universe. The question was whether the universe was finite or infinite, and what lay beyond its edge if it was finite. Einstein wrote back. The letter explained that in general relativity, the universe could be finite but unbounded, like the surface of a sphere. There is no edge because the geometry curves back on itself. This letter shaped Everett's life. He kept it. He told people about it. The idea that the greatest living physicist had taken the time to write to a 12-year-old, explaining the deepest questions of cosmology, stayed with him. Everett studied chemical engineering at Catholic University of America, then switched to mathematics. He was accepted to graduate school at Princeton in 1953. His advisor was John Wheeler, one of the most respected and imaginative physicists in the world. a man who had worked with Bohr on nuclear fission and would later coin the term black hole. Everett became interested in the measurement problem. His solution was radical, and it emerged directly from the formalism. What if, he asked, we simply take the Schrödinger equation seriously at all times? What if we refuse to add a collapse postulate? What if the wave function never collapses, and all we need is unitary evolution? In that case, every time a measurement occurs, the observer becomes entangled with the system in a superposition. If you measure an electron that could be spin up or spin down, you do not collapse the electron to one state. Instead, you become entangled with it. There is now a you who saw spin up and a you who saw spin down, both equally real, both coexisting in the universal wave function. This was the many worlds interpretation, though Everett did not use that phrase. He called it the relative state formulation. The idea was that after a measurement, there are multiple branches of the wave function, each one representing a different outcome, each one containing a version of the observer who saw that outcome. The interpretation is mathematically elegant. It requires no collapse postulate. It requires no special role for observers. All systems, including observers, evolve according to the same equation. Measurement is just entanglement. The apparent collapse is an illusion created by the branching. But elegance did not guarantee acceptance. Wheeler was intrigued by the idea, but worried about how it would be received. He arranged for Everett to visit Copenhagen in 1956 to present the work to Bohr and his circle. The visit was a disaster. Bohr was unimpressed. Age Peterson, Bohr's assistant, was dismissive. Leon Rosenfeld was hostile. Wheeler came back with bad news. The thesis as written could not be accepted. It was too confrontational, too explicit in its challenge to Copenhagen. Wheeler pressured Everett to cut it down, to remove the direct attacks on Bohr's philosophy, to frame it as a mathematical exercise rather than a revolutionary reinterpretation. Everett was furious. He complied, but he resented it. The final published version was less than 1/3 the length of his original draft. The sharp philosophical edges were sanded off. What remained was technically correct, but stripped of its explanatory power. In private correspondence, Everett raged against the Copenhagen orthodoxy. He called it hopelessly incomplete because of its reliance on classical physics and a philosophic monstrosity with a reality concept for the macroscopic world and denial of the same for the microcosm. When Bryce DeWitt, who would later become a champion of many worlds, objected that he could not feel himself split, Everett retorted that critics of Copernicus also said they could not feel themselves moving through the heavens. The absence of direct sensation proves nothing. But none of this mattered professionally. The physics establishment was not interested in interpretations. Foundations were career poison. Everett's draft deferment from military service was expiring, and he needed a job. In June of 1956, before his thesis was even formally accepted, he left academia and joined the Pentagon's Weapons Systems Evaluation Group. He never returned to physics. His work there involved calculating nuclear fallout patterns and advising presidents on hydrogen bomb strategy. He determined optimal targeting strategies for nuclear war. He helped assess which military responses would maximize enemy casualties while minimizing American ones. He co-founded two defense contractors, Lambda Corporation in 1964 and DBS Corporation in 1973. He made a great deal of money. He lived well. He was, by conventional measures, successful. But he was also miserable. He became a heavy drinker and a heavy smoker. He gained weight. He was emotionally distant from his family. His wife, Nancy, struggled with mental illness. His son Mark, born in 1963, grew up not knowing what his father had done or what he believed. Hugh Everett died of heart failure on July 19, 1982. He was 51 years old. Mark, who would later become the lead singer of the rock band Eels, found his body. In an interview years later, Mark said that he felt no emotion when he found his father dead. They had been strangers who happened to live in the same house. Everett had left instructions in his will. He wanted his ashes thrown in the trash, not scattered, thrown away. His wife kept them at first, but eventually she complied with his wish. Elizabeth Everett, Hugh's daughter, struggled with mental illness her entire life. In 1996, she committed suicide. In her note, she asked that her ashes be thrown out in the trash, adding that maybe that way she would end up in the correct parallel universe to meet up with Daddy. This is what it cost to challenge the foundations of quantum mechanics in the middle of the 20th century. Not just professional marginalization, personal devastation. John Clauser's story is perhaps the most instructive because his punishment came specifically for testing foundational questions experimentally. Clauser was born in 1942 in Pasadena, California. His father was a prominent aeronautical engineer who had helped design early jet aircraft. Young Clauser grew up around science and technology. He was good with his hands. He liked building things. He went to Columbia for graduate school. At Columbia, Clauser became interested in Bell's theorem. John Stuart Bell, a physicist at CERN, had proven in 1964 that quantum mechanics makes predictions that no local hidden variable theory can reproduce. The proof was mathematical, but the claim was empirical. You could, in principle, test it. You could create pairs of entangled particles, measure them in various combinations, and check whether the correlations violated Bell's inequality. If they did, it would prove that the universe is not locally realistic. Either particles do not have definite properties before measurement, or influences can travel faster than light, or both. Either way, something fundamental about our intuitions was wrong. Clauser wanted to run the experiment. His thesis advisor told him he was out of his mind. The entire physics department told him the same thing. Everybody knew that Einstein was wrong. Clauser later recalled that he was getting senile was frequently the claim. Questioning the completeness of quantum mechanics was not just bad physics, it was bad manners. The hard part was getting around this. This was a religion among physicists. He approached Richard Feynman at Caltech, hoping for support from the greatest living physicist. Feynman was famous for his intuition, his willingness to challenge conventional wisdom, his disdain for pretense. Surely Feynman would appreciate the importance of testing foundational claims experimentally. He was actually angry, Clauser recalled. As best I could tell, he was angry that I was challenging doing an experiment to test the predictions of quantum mechanics. Everybody knows predictions of quantum mechanics are perfect. Do not even need to look. This was the culture. Do not even need to look. The predictions of quantum mechanics had been confirmed so many times that testing them again was considered a waste of resources. The fact that no one had ever tested this particular prediction, the one that Bell had identified as crucial for understanding the nature of reality, did not matter. The question was not considered real physics. Clauser persevered. He found a collaborator, Stuart Friedman, and together they built an experiment at Berkeley. The setup used calcium atoms excited by ultraviolet light, which emitted pairs of entangled photons. Polarizers measured the photons' polarization at various angles. The correlations were recorded. They published their results in 1972 in Physical Review Letters. The title was Experimental Test of Local Hidden Variable Theories. The result was unambiguous. The correlations violated Bell's inequality by 6 standard deviations. Local hidden variable theories were ruled out. Quantum mechanics was correct, and the universe was not locally realistic. This was one of the most important experimental results in the history of physics. It settled a debate that had been raging since Einstein, Podolsky, and Rosen in 1935. It proved something fundamental about the nature of reality, and the response was a collective shrug. Nice experiment, people told Clauser, but maybe you want to go out and measure some numbers and stop wasting time and money and instead start doing some real physics. Clauser never held a permanent academic position. He bounced from institution to institution, doing research grants, consulting, working on the margins of the field. The work that should have made his career instead marked him as someone who did not understand what physics was supposed to be about. Stuart Friedman, his collaborator, had a more conventional career. He became a professor at Berkeley, worked on other topics, built a respectable CV, but he died in 2012, a decade before the Nobel Committee finally recognized the work. Clauser was 80 years old when he received a call from Stockholm. He had waited 50 years for the physics community to acknowledge what he had done. He shared the prize with Alain Aspect, who had done improved versions of the experiment in the 1980s, and Anton Zeilinger, who had pushed the tests to new levels of precision and developed quantum teleportation. Clauser's comment on the half-century delay was characteristically dry. My claim to fame is that I have lived long enough. There is a lesson here. The physics establishment can be wrong. The consensus can be wrong. The questions that everyone considers silly or unprofessional can turn out to be the most important questions of all. But learning this lesson requires waiting 50 years and hoping you survive long enough to see the vindication. This history helps explain why the 2019 experiments have not reshaped physics the way they should have. The culture remembers what happened to Bohm, Everett, Clauser. The culture remembers that foundational questions are career poison. Even now, even after the Nobel Prize, the instinct is to look away. The delayed choice quantum eraser experiments, first performed in 2000 by a team including Marlon Scully and Yoon-Ho Kim, are another case where popular misunderstanding has spread further than the actual physics. The setup is intricate. Entangled photon pairs are created. The signal photon goes to a detector screen. The idler photon goes through an apparatus that can either preserve or erase which path information. The key is that the idler measurement happens 8 nanoseconds after the signal photon is detected. Dozens of YouTube videos and popular articles claim this experiment proves retrocausality, that the future can change the past. They point out that erasing the which path information after the signal photon is detected causes an interference pattern to appear. This seems to suggest that the later choice retroactively affected the earlier detection. But this is a misunderstanding. The interference pattern does not appear in the raw data at the signal detector. It only appears when you correlate the signal detections with specific subsets of idler detections. The total pattern at the signal detector always looks the same, with or without which path information. No information is transmitted backward in time. No choices change the past. What the experiment demonstrates is subtler. It shows that whether interference exists depends on whether which path information exists anywhere, even if no one ever looks at it. The correlation is there from the beginning, established at the moment of entanglement. The later choice of measurement on the idler just selects which subset of the data you look at. This is strange enough without invoking retrocausality. It means that the very availability of which path information, even information that no one accesses, is sufficient to prohibit interference. The universe keeps track. If the information exists, interference is blocked. If the information does not exist, interference appears. But the popular accounts go further than the physics supports. They claim that consciousness, or choice, or the future can reach back and alter the past. These claims are not warranted by the experimental results. They are interpretations layered on top of the data. Interpretations that the physicists who did the work would not endorse. John Bell himself understood the culture he was fighting against. In 1981, he wrote that making a virtue of necessity and influenced by positivistic and instrumentalist philosophies, many came to hold not only that it is difficult to find a coherent picture, but that it is wrong to look for one. If not actually immoral, then certainly unprofessional. He also asked the question that cuts to the heart of the observer problem. Was the wave function waiting to jump for thousands of millions of years until a single-celled, living creature appeared? Or did it have to wait a little longer for some highly qualified measurer with a PhD? The answer, as the experiments have shown, is that the wave function does not wait for anyone. It does not require a PhD. It does not require a single-celled organism. It does not require consciousness. It just requires interaction. The environment is always watching. But physicists still do not want to talk about what that means. Howard Wiseman, one of the authors of the local friendliness paper, admitted it directly. Yeah, it makes a lot of physicists uncomfortable, and for good reason. It is very tricky to think about and liable to get you labeled as not actually doing physics. But I guess I'm at the stage in my career where I don't have to worry about that. The 2025 survey published in Nature, the largest survey of physicist attitudes ever conducted, showed that the culture is changing, but slowly. Over 1,100 researchers responded out of 15,000 who were invited. The response rate itself was telling. Most physicists approached about their views on interpretation simply did not reply. The question was not interesting to them, or it was too sensitive, or it felt like a distraction from real work. Among those who did respond, Copenhagen remained the most popular interpretation at 36%. This number is striking when you consider that there is no single Copenhagen interpretation. Bohr, Heisenberg, Pauli, and Born all held different views. Modern physicists who identify as Copenhagenists often mean different things by the label. What unites them is a reluctance to say anything definite about what the formalism means, a commitment to the predictions without commitment to a picture of reality. Many worlds came in at 15%, up from lower numbers in earlier surveys. This interpretation has been gaining ground, especially among younger physicists and those working in quantum information. Its appeal is mathematical elegance. There is no collapse postulate. There is no special role for observers, just the wave function, evolving unitarily, forever. Epistemic interpretations, including cubism and relational quantum mechanics, accounted for about 17%. This is a significant increase from earlier surveys, where these approaches barely registered. The growth reflects a shift in how physicists think about the theory. More of them are willing to say that the wave function represents knowledge or beliefs, rather than objective physical reality. Bohmian mechanics, despite being the oldest alternative to Copenhagen, attracted only about 7% support. This may reflect the interpretation's reputation as philosophically motivated rather than scientifically necessary. It may also reflect the difficulty of extending pilot wave theory to relativistic quantum mechanics and quantum field theory. Other interpretations, including objective collapse theories, superdeterminism, and various idiosyncratic approaches, made up the remainder. But the most striking numbers were these. Only 24% of respondents were confident that their preferred interpretation is correct. 3/4 of physicists working on the foundations of their own field are uncertain about what the theory actually means. This is remarkable. In no other mature science would such widespread disagreement about basic principles be tolerated. And nearly 50% said that physics departments do not give enough attention to quantum foundations. Only 5% said too much. The practitioners themselves believe their field is neglecting its most fundamental questions. Renato Renner, whose Frau-Schigger-Renner paper sparked so much recent debate, commented on the survey results. "It is a very deeply emotional thing," he said. "People's views on interpretation are tied up with their sense of what physics is for, what it can accomplish, what it means to understand the world." Gemma de les Coves, a physicist at Pompeu Fabra University in Barcelona, said something similar. "I find it remarkable that people who are very knowledgeable about quantum theory can be convinced of completely opposite views. The same equations, the same experimental results lead different physicists to entirely different conclusions about the nature of reality." Carlton Caves, a physicist at the University of New Mexico, who has spent decades on foundational questions, was blunter. "It is just embarrassing that we do not have a story to tell people about what reality is. When someone asks what quantum mechanics means, the honest answer from most physicists is, we do not know, and we are not sure it is our job to find out." Sean Carroll, the physicist who has done more than anyone to popularize many worlds, previously called the spread of interpretational views the most embarrassing graph in modern physics. 100 years of the most successful theory in science, and we cannot agree on what it is telling us about the world. At the centenary celebration of quantum mechanics in Helgoland in June of 2005, the disagreements were on full display. Anton Zeilinger, the experimentalist who shared the 2022 Nobel Prize, declared that there is no quantum world, meaning that quantum states exist only in the observer's description, not in some external reality. Alain Aspect, who shared the same Nobel, stood up and said simply, "I disagree." This is where physics stands. 100 years after Heisenberg's breakthrough, predictions confirmed to 11 decimal places, technologies that depend on quantum mechanics generating trillions of dollars in economic value, and fundamental disagreement about what the theory means, whether the wave function is real, whether collapse occurs, whether observers are special, whether there is an objective reality independent of observation. The experiments have been done. The data are in. and the physicists cannot agree on what they mean. John Archibald Wheeler died in 2008 at age 96. By any measure, he was one of the giants of 20th century physics. He coined the terms black hole, wormhole, and quantum foam. He supervised 46 PhD students, including Richard Feynman and Kip Thorne, both of whom won Nobel Prizes. He worked with Niels Bohr on the theory of nuclear fission. He helped design the hydrogen bomb, and he spent the last decades of his life haunted by the question of what an observer really is. Wheeler was born on July 9, 1911, in Jacksonville, Florida. His father was a librarian. His mother was a librarian. Books filled his childhood home. He was intellectually precocious, winning a scholarship to Johns Hopkins University at age 16. He earned his PhD at 21, then went to Copenhagen to study with Bohr. The collaboration with Bohr was transformative. In 1939, just before World War II engulfed Europe, Wheeler and Bohr published their famous paper explaining nuclear fission. They showed that uranium-235 was the isotope that fissioned easily, not the more common uranium-238. This finding was crucial to the Manhattan Project. Wheeler joined the Manhattan Project in January of 1942. He worked first in Wigner's group at the University of Chicago, then became the leading physicist at the Hanford site in Washington State, where plutonium was produced for the atomic bombs. When the B reactor inexplicably shut down shortly after starting up, it was Wheeler who diagnosed the problem. Xenon-135, a fission product, was absorbing neutrons and poisoning the reaction. Wheeler figured this out and found the solution. His involvement with nuclear weapons was personal in ways that most physicists' involvement was not. His younger brother Joe was a soldier in Italy. Joe believed the war could be ended quickly if the bomb was ready. He sent Wheeler a postcard from the front lines with 2 words, "Hurry up." Joe was killed in action on October 10, 1944. The Trinity test did not occur until July 16, 1945, 9 months too late. The Hiroshima bomb was dropped on August 6th. The Nagasaki bomb, made with Hanford plutonium from Wheeler's reactors, was dropped on August 9th. The war ended on August 15th. Wheeler carried his brother's death with him for the rest of his life. In interviews decades later, he would still become emotional when discussing it. He wondered if he could have worked faster. He wondered if Joe would have survived if the bomb had been ready sooner. He wondered about the road not taken, and somehow this grief connected to his physics. Wheeler became obsessed with time. He asked whether the past was fixed or malleable. He wondered whether observation could reach backward. His delayed choice experiment, proposed in 1978, seemed to suggest that present choices could determine past events. Wheeler married Jeanette Hegner in 1935. They stayed together for 72 years until his death. He was known for his kindness, his creativity, and his willingness to entertain wild ideas. He encouraged his students to think big. He told them that the job of a physicist was not just to solve problems, but to discover new problems, to find the places where current understanding broke down. One of his most famous phrases was "the boundary of a boundary is zero," a mathematical statement from topology that he believed held deep physical significance. Another was space-time tells matter how to move, and matter tells space-time how to curve. His summary of of general relativity. And of course, there was it from bit, his late career attempt to ground physics in information theory. Wheeler's delayed choice experiment, proposed in 1978, demonstrated something deeply strange. Imagine a photon approaching a barrier with two slits. In the standard setup, if you do not measure which slit the photon goes through, it displays interference, behaving like a wave that passed through both slits. If you do measure which slit, the interference disappears, and it behaves like a particle that passed through one slit. Wheeler asked, what if you delay the choice? What if you let the photon pass through the slits, and only then decide whether to measure which path information or look for interference? The results confirm quantum mechanics. The photon displays interference or not, depending on your later choice. It is as if your decision, made after the photon has already traversed the apparatus, determines what the photon did in the past. Wheeler proposed an even more dramatic version. A photon from a distant quasar, billions of light years away, might be gravitationally lensed around an intervening galaxy. An astronomer on Earth could in principle decide today whether to measure interference or which path information. That decision would affect what path the photon took billions of years ago. His conclusion: it is not a paradox that we choose what shall have happened after it has already happened, because it has not really happened. It is not a phenomenon until it is an observed phenomenon. This led Wheeler to his concept of the participatory universe. No elementary phenomenon is a phenomenon until it is an observed phenomenon. We are not just observers, he said. We are participators in bringing into being not only the near and here, but the far away and long ago. But Wheeler was uncomfortable with making consciousness central. He wrote that consciousness seems to appertain to the individual. For my money, the relevant concept should be a community property. By the late 1980s, he had moved away from talking about observation in terms of consciousness at all. Instead, he developed his it from bit concept. Every particle, every field of force, even space-time itself, he proposed, derives its existence from the apparatus' elicited answers to yes-no questions, binary choices, bits. In Wheeler's final vision, the universe is not made of matter, it is made of information. And that information does not exist independently of the questions that are asked. Reality is participatory. It requires observation. But observation is not a human act. It is the process by which information is extracted from systems. Any system that can ask a yes-no question and record the answer is participating in the creation of reality. This brings us back to the 2019 experiments. If a photon can be an observer, and if observation is the process by which reality is created, then the universe is not a collection of objects waiting to be seen. It is a web of interactions, each one asking and answering questions, each one creating the facts that become real. The interpretations of quantum mechanics differ on how to cash this out. Many worlds says that all outcomes happen, and observers merely find themselves in one branch. There is no collapse, no special moment of measurement, no role for consciousness. The wave function branches, and each branch contains observers who experience that branch's outcome. The price is ontological extravagance, an infinity of parallel worlds that we can never access or verify. Relational quantum mechanics, developed by Carlo Rovelli and others, says that facts exist only relative to observers, and there is no view from nowhere. This interpretation takes seriously the lesson of special relativity, that simultaneity is relative, and extends it to quantum mechanics. Just as there is no universal now in relativity, there may be no universal fact in quantum mechanics. What happened depends on who is asking. Rovelli has said that quantum theory is the discovery that a fact might be real with respect to you and not real with respect to me. Cubism, developed primarily by Christopher Fuchs, Ruediger Schack, and David Mermin, says that the wave function represents an individual agent's expectations, and collapse is just updating beliefs. On this view, quantum mechanics is not about objective reality at all. It is about what individual observers can consistently say about their experiences. The wave function is personal. Your wave function is different from mine because we have different information and different experiences. Objective collapse theories, like the GRW theory proposed by Girardi, Rimini, and Weber in 1986, say that something in the physics causes collapse without any observers at all. These theories modify the Schrödinger equation, adding spontaneous localization events that become more likely as systems get larger. A single particle almost never collapses spontaneously. A macroscopic object made of countless particles collapses almost immediately. No observer required. Roger Penrose has proposed that gravity itself triggers collapse. When a superposition involves different distributions of mass and hence different gravitational fields, the energy difference creates an instability that forces the system into one state or the other. This would make collapse a physical process governed by known physics, with no special role for measurement or observation. None of these interpretations is proven. None is consensus. The 2025 survey showed wild disagreement among experts. The only thing most physicists agree on is that we do not have a satisfying answer, and that is the state of physics 100 years after Heisenberg's breakthrough on the island of Helgoland. 100 years of the most successful theory in the history of science. Predictions confirmed to 11 decimal places. Technologies built on quantum mechanics that underpin the modern world. And we still cannot answer John Bell's question about whether the wave function waited for a PhD. The experiments have been published. The results have been verified. Non-human systems can observe. The environment is observing constantly. And if quantum mechanics is universal, if it applies to observers just as it applies to electrons, then observer-independent facts may not exist. Different observers can have different facts about the same event, and quantum mechanics says they are both right. You are not a privileged viewer of reality. You are a physical system entangled with other physical systems, extracting information through interactions. The facts you observe are not pre-existing truths revealed by your gaze. They are created by the observation itself, and they are real only relative to you. The photon is also observing. The air molecule is also observing. The detector is also observing. There is no outside to this web. There is no view from nowhere. There is no objective truth that exists before some system asks a question. Wheeler imagined the universe as a great eye looking at itself. But even that metaphor is too comforting. It suggests a unified perspective, a single gaze. The experiments say otherwise. The experiments say there are only gazes, plural, interlocking, mutually constituting. Each one creates facts that are real for it. none of them is more fundamental than any other. This is what the physics says. This is what has been confirmed. And the physicists who proved it would rather talk about something else. But before we reach that conclusion, there is more to understand about how the environment actually performs its constant surveillance. Because the details matter. The mechanism by which non-human observation occurs tells us something profound about the nature of reality itself. When Zurek developed his theory of einselection in the early 1980s, he was working at the intersection of information theory and quantum mechanics. His key insight was that the environment does not just passively receive information from quantum systems. It actively selects which information gets amplified and which gets washed out. Think about a dust grain floating in sunlight. Every second, that dust grain is bombarded by something like 10 to the 20th photons. Each photon that bounces off the grain carries away information about where the grain is located. After even a tiny fraction of a second, the grain's position has been recorded redundantly in countless scattered photons, spread out across the room, many of them now traveling at the speed of light toward the walls, the ceiling, eventually out into space. This bombardment is so intense that any quantum superposition of the dust grain's position would decohere almost instantaneously. Zurek calculated the decoherence time for various objects. For a large molecule at room temperature, it is about 10 to the minus 17 seconds. For a dust grain, it is even faster. For anything macroscopic, it is so fast that the number is effectively zero. There is no time for quantum weirdness to manifest. The environment has already observed. But here is the subtle part. The environment does not just observe anything. It observes specific things. When photons scatter off a dust grain, they record information about position, not about momentum in superposition states. When air molecules bounce off an object, they record information about where the object is, not about some exotic quantum property that has no classical analog. This is einselection at work. The environment, through its interactions, picks out certain observables as special. These are the pointer observables. For macroscopic objects, position is the pointer observable. The environment is extremely good at monitoring position and extremely bad at monitoring superpositions of position. So position states are stable. They survive environmental scrutiny. Superposition states are unstable. They get rapidly entangled with the environment and become effectively classical. Zurek's point is that this is not arbitrary. The pointer states are the ones that generate the least entanglement with the environment for a given interaction Hamiltonian. They are, in a precise mathematical sense, the most robust states. Everything else gets washed away. This explains why the classical world looks classical. It is not because consciousness collapsed the wave functions. It is not because some mysterious measurement occurred. It is because the environment, through billions of interactions per second, is constantly selecting for classicality. The quantum weirdness is still there, mathematically, but it is hidden, encoded in correlations with environmental degrees of freedom that are practically inaccessible. And this brings us back to the question of what counts as an observer. In the decoherence framework, an observer is just any system that becomes correlated with another system in a way that transfers information. A photon that bounces off a dust grain is observing the dust grain. An air molecule that collides with an electron is observing the electron. There is nothing special about brains or consciousness or intelligence. Observation is just correlation inducing interaction. The 1998 Weizmann experiment demonstrated this directly. The researchers built a tiny interferometer, a device that splits an electron beam into two paths and then recombines them. When the paths are undisturbed, the electrons display interference, the hallmark of quantum superposition. The electron went through both paths simultaneously. But the team added a twist. They placed a small electronic detector near one of the paths. The detector was not being monitored by any human. No one was looking at its readout, but the detector itself could become correlated with the electron's path. If the electron went through the monitored path, the detector would register a small signal. The result was unambiguous. When the detector was sensitive enough to distinguish which path the electron took, the interference pattern disappeared. The electron behaved like a classical particle, going through one path or the other, not both. When the detector's sensitivity was reduced, so it could not reliably distinguish the paths, interference returned. The human experimenters were watching the same interference pattern throughout. Their observation did not change. What changed was whether the detector could observe. A small electronic device with no consciousness, no intelligence, no awareness, collapsed the wave function just as effectively as a human observer would have. The researchers' conclusion was precise. The very act of obtaining which path information, whether or not anyone looks at it, is sufficient to destroy interference. The observation does not have to be conscious. It just has to happen. This finding has been replicated in dozens of experiments since. The 2007 Berkeley experiment pushed it even further. Using a hydrogen molecule as the quantum system, the researchers showed that a single electron, one of the simplest entities in physics, could act as an observer of another electron's path. The setup was elegant. An X-ray photon hit a hydrogen molecule and ejected both electrons. One electron came out fast, the other slow. The fast electron could, in principle, have been ejected from either of the two protons in the molecule, giving it two possible paths. If nothing measured which proton the fast electron came from, it would display interference. But the slow electron carried information. Its energy and angle depended on which proton the fast electron came from. The slow electron was entangled with the fast electron's path. It was observing, and that was enough. The fast electron showed no interference. The slow electron, a single particle with no brain, no detector, no recording device, had collapsed the superposition simply by being correlated with it. Ali Belkacem, who led the experiment, pointed out the implications. Decoherence and loss of information occur on the very tiny scale of a single hydrogen molecule. The environment does not need to be macroscopic. Even a single particle can observe. Now consider what this means for the experiments that followed. When the Heriot-Watt team used photons as observers, they were not making a strange philosophical claim. They were extending a well-established result. If electrons can observe, why not photons? If any correlation-inducing interaction counts as observation, then the simplest possible observer is a single quantum of light interacting with another. The experiment tested whether, when you treat the observer as a quantum system and apply quantum mechanics consistently, you still get coherent results. The answer was no. Here is the setup in more detail. The team created pairs of entangled photons using a nonlinear crystal. Each pair was directed toward a different apparatus. In each apparatus, one photon was designated the system and the other the friend. The friend photon interacted with the system photon in a way that correlated the friend's path with the system's polarization. This was the observation. From the friend's perspective, so to speak, the system photon was now in a definite polarization state. The friend had observed it. But from outside the apparatus, from Wigner's perspective, the entire system, including the friend, was still in superposition. The Wigner outside could perform a joint measurement on both the system and the friend, checking for interference that would only be present if the superposition persisted. The key was that the experiment involved two such setups, one for each half of the entangled pair, two Wigners, two friends, and the two Wigners could compare their results, performing a Bell-type test to check for correlations that would violate local observer independence. They violated it by 5 standard deviations. The results showed that if you assume facts are absolute, that what the friend observed is simply true regardless of perspective, then the correlations between the two Wigner's measurements are impossible. The only way to explain the data is to abandon the idea that the friend's observation established an objective fact. The critics who called this ridiculous were missing the point. The point was not that photons are conscious. The point was that the quantum formalism does not distinguish between a photon observer and a human observer. If you think there is a difference, if you think consciousness matters, then you are adding something to quantum mechanics that is not in the equations. You are making a metaphysical assumption, not a scientific one. And if that assumption is wrong, if there is nothing special about consciousness, then the results apply to all observers, including you. The Frauchiger-Renner thought experiment makes this even more explicit. Let me walk through the logic more carefully, because the details matter. There are 4 agents. Alice and Bob are on the outside. Each has a friend inside a sealed laboratory. Call them Alice's friend and Bob's friend. The experiment proceeds in steps. Step 1. Alice's friend prepares a quantum coin in a superposition of heads and tails. She measures it and records the result. From her perspective, the coin is now definite. She saw either heads or tails. Step 2. Based on her result, Alice's friend prepares a particle in a certain quantum state and sends it to Bob's friend. Step 3. Bob's friend measures the particle. From his perspective, he now has a definite result. Step 4. Alice, from outside the laboratory, performs a measurement on the entire laboratory, including her friend. This is not a measurement of what the friend saw. It is a joint measurement on the friend and the coin together, testing for interference. Step 5. Bob does the same, measuring his entire laboratory, including his friend. Now here is the problem. Each agent can use quantum mechanics to reason about what the others will observe. Alice's friend knows what she saw. She can use quantum mechanics to predict what Alice will see. Bob's friend knows what he saw. He can use quantum mechanics to predict what Bob will see. And when you work through the logic, assuming quantum mechanics is correct and that reasoning is consistent, you reach a contradiction. Specifically, there exist scenarios where Alice's friend can correctly predict that Alice will see a certain result, and Bob's friend can correctly predict that Bob will see a certain result. But those two predictions are logically incompatible. They cannot both be true. Yet if quantum mechanics is correct, each friend's prediction should be right. The only way out is to abandon one of three assumptions. Either quantum predictions sometimes fail, or logical reasoning can break down, or measurements do not yield single definite outcomes. Most physicists are unwilling to abandon quantum predictions. The theory has been confirmed to extraordinary precision. Most are also unwilling to abandon logic. That leaves the third option. Measurements, even when they seem definite to the person performing them, may not establish absolute facts. This is exactly what the Heriot-Watt experiment confirmed, and the Griffith local friendliness theorem made it even more precise. The team showed that you can derive inequalities similar to Bell inequalities, but even stronger, that are violated if you assume observed events are absolute. Their theorem identifies exactly what has to give. If you want to keep locality and free choice, you must abandon the absoluteness of observed events. If you want to keep absoluteness, you must abandon either locality or free choice. There is no fourth option. The implications are staggering. For a century, physicists have been arguing about whether the wave function is real, about when collapse occurs, about what constitutes a measurement. These experiments suggest that the arguments were missing the point. The question is not when collapse occurs. The question is whether there is a single, observer-independent fact about what happened at all. Consider what this means for your everyday experience. You look at a coffee cup. Photons scatter off the cup, enter your eyes, trigger neurons, create an experience. You see the cup in a particular location. According to Decoherence, this experience is robust because the cup's position has been recorded redundantly in the environment. Billions of scattered photons carry the information. Your eyes just access one tiny fraction of the distributed record. The cup is really there, in the sense that any system that checks will find the same answer. But the Wigner's friend experiments suggest a deeper strangeness. Your experience of seeing the cup is itself a physical process. You, the observer, are a quantum system. From the perspective of a super observer outside your light cone, you might still be in superposition, entangled with the cup, in a state where you saw it here and you saw it there. Of course, no such super observer exists in practice. You cannot put a human being in a coherent quantum superposition. The decoherence from your own body heat, from the air around you, from the photons hitting your skin, is so rapid that any superposition would be destroyed instantly. But the principle remains. If quantum mechanics is universal, it applies to you. And if it applies to you, then your observations are not privileged. They are just one perspective among many, each as valid as any other, none of them representing the absolute truth. David Deutsch, one of the founders of quantum computing, has proposed that the definitive test of these ideas would involve an artificial intelligence running on a quantum computer. Unlike a human brain, a quantum computer can in principle maintain coherent superpositions for extended periods. If you built an AGI on such a platform, you could put it in superposition, let it make observations, and then check whether those observations became absolute facts or remained relative. Deutsch has said that this experiment would distinguish between interpretations of quantum mechanics that give consciousness a special role and those that do not. If the AI's observations are just as susceptible to superposition as a photon's observations, then there is nothing special about minds. If, on the other hand, the AI's observations somehow always yield definite outcomes, that would suggest something different is going on. We do not have such AI yet. We do not have quantum computers powerful enough to run one. But the theoretical framework is clear, and the simpler experiments point in a consistent direction. Observation does not require consciousness. It does not require complexity. It requires only interaction. The history of physics in the 20th century is partly a history of expanding what counts as real. Einstein showed that time is not absolute. It depends on your motion. Two observers moving relative to each other will disagree about the order of events, and both are right. There is no universal now. Quantum mechanics may be showing us something analogous about facts. Just as simultaneity is relative in special relativity, observed outcomes may be relative in quantum mechanics. Two observers can disagree about what happened, and both can be right because there is no observer-independent fact about what happened. This is what Carlo Rovelli's relational quantum mechanics proposes. Rovelli, an Italian physicist who has done foundational work on quantum gravity, argues that quantum states are always relative to an observer. When you say an electron has spin up, you are saying it has spin up relative to you. Another observer who has not interacted with the electron can consistently say it is in a superposition of spin up and spin down. There is no contradiction because there is no absolute state. There are only states relative to observers. Rovelli puts it starkly. Is it possible that a fact might be real with respect to you and not real with respect to me? Quantum theory, I believe, is the discovery that the answer is yes. This sounds like relativism, like the denial of objective truth, but Rovelli insists it is physics, not philosophy. The mathematics of quantum mechanics already implies this. We have just been refusing to read what the equations are telling us. He draws on the Buddhist philosopher Nagarjuna, who argued 2,000 years ago that nothing has intrinsic existence. Everything exists only in relation to other things. For Rovelli, quantum mechanics is the scientific vindication of this ancient insight. The universe is not made of things with intrinsic properties. It is made of relations. Cubism, developed primarily by Christopher Fuchs at the University of Massachusetts, takes a different approach but reaches similar conclusions. For cubists, the wave function is not a physical thing. It represents an individual agent's expectations about measurement outcomes. Collapse is not a physical process. It is the agent updating their beliefs in light of new information. On this view, quantum mechanics is fundamentally about what individual observers can say, not about objective reality. Fuchs has said that quantum mechanics is a law of thought. It tells you how to reason about the world. It does not tell you what the world is made of independent of observers. Critics find this unsatisfying. They want physics to describe objective reality, not just subjective expectations. But cubists respond that this demand itself is the problem. The assumption that there must be an objective, observer-independent reality underlying our observations is not justified by the physics. It is a philosophical prejudice. The many worlds interpretation takes yet another approach. In many worlds, the wave function never collapses. All outcomes occur. Every time a measurement happens, the universe branches, and each branch contains an observer who saw a different result. Sean Carroll, one of the most prominent defenders of many worlds, argues that this interpretation requires no special role for observers and no collapse postulate. It is the minimal interpretation, the one that takes the equations at face value. without adding extra ingredients. Observers are just physical systems that become correlated with other physical systems. There is nothing special about them. The price is ontological extravagance. Many worlds implies an enormous, perhaps infinite, proliferation of branches. Everything that can happen does happen somewhere. Your counterparts are out there, in branches you can never access, living out every possible variation of your life. Most physicists find this hard to swallow. The 2025 Nature survey showed many worlds had 15% support, well behind Copenhagen, but growing. Among younger physicists, it is more popular. Carroll has argued that the discomfort people feel about many worlds is emotional, not scientific. We do not like the idea of infinite copies of ourselves, but liking has nothing to do with truth. What all these interpretations share is the rejection of a simple, naive realism about measurement. None of them says that observation is a special process that reveals pre-existing facts. Each, in its own way, says that what we call observation is something more subtle, more entangled, more relative than our intuitions suggest. The question remains, why will physicists not discuss this? The institutional pressures are real. We have seen what happened to Bohm, Everett, Clauser, but the culture has shifted since then. The Nobel Prize in 2002 was a watershed. Foundations research is more respectable than it was. Young physicists can work on these questions without automatic career suicide. And yet the discomfort persists. The 2025 survey showed nearly half of physicists think their field does not pay enough attention to foundations. But when you ask them what they personally believe, they scatter across a dozen incompatible interpretations, and 76% are not confident in their own view. Part of the problem is that the implications are genuinely disturbing. If observer-independent facts do not exist, what are we even doing when we do science? Science is supposed to be the enterprise of discovering objective truths about the world. If there are no objective truths, just perspectives, does science collapse into relativism? The answer is no, but explaining why requires subtlety. Quantum mechanics is still a spectacularly successful theory. Its predictions are confirmed to extraordinary precision. Different observers using quantum mechanics will agree on those predictions, even if they disagree on what is fundamentally real. Science works because it focuses on the predictions, on what observers will experience, not on metaphysical claims about observer-independent reality. But this instrumentalist move, the shut up and calculate approach, feels like an evasion. It tells you how to use the theory without telling you what the theory is about. It leaves the foundational questions unanswered. Another part of the problem is the association with pseudoscience. The consciousness causes collapse idea was picked up by New Age movements in the 1970s and 80s. Quantum mysticism became a cottage industry. Gurus claimed that quantum mechanics validated meditation, positive thinking, the power of intention. The Secret told millions of readers that they could manifest their desires by observing them into reality. This made serious physicists allergic to any discussion of observers and consciousness. The whole topic felt contaminated. To talk about it was to risk association with charlatans. But the experiments we have been discussing are not quantum mysticism. They are peer-reviewed physics, published in the most respected journals, awarded the highest prizes. The findings do not support the secret. They do not say that your wishes can influence reality. They say something much stranger, that what counts as reality depends on who is asking, and that there may be no fact of the matter independent of the asking. This is harder to sell books with. It does not flatter the reader's sense of power. It does not promise that you can control the universe with your thoughts. It says that you, the observer, are just another physical system, no more privileged than a photon or an electron. Your observations create facts for you, but so do theirs for them. John Wheeler spent his last decades grappling with these questions. He had personal reasons to care about them, rooted in his brother's death and his own role in building the bomb. But he also had scientific reasons. He saw that quantum mechanics was pointing towards something profound about the nature of reality, and he refused to look away. His it from bit proposal, first presented in 1989, was an attempt to make sense of what the physics seemed to be saying. The idea was that the fundamental currency of the universe is not matter or energy, but information. Every particle, every field of force, even space-time itself, derives its existence from the answers to yes-no questions. This sounds mystical, but Wheeler was careful. He did not claim that consciousness creates reality. He claimed that reality is participatory. It requires questions to be asked, but the questions can be asked by any physical system capable of registering binary alternatives. A detector can ask a question. A photon can ask a question. The universe is a vast web of questions and answers, each one creating a bit of reality. Wheeler's phrase for this was the participatory universe. We are not observers in the sense of passive spectators. We are participants, and our participation is not special. It is continuous with the participation of every other physical system. The delayed choice experiments supported this vision. Your choice of measurement, made after the photon has already passed through the apparatus, determines what kind of history the photon has. Not because the future changes the past, but because the past is not defined until it is observed. There is no fact about what the photon did until a question is asked. Wheeler imagined an even more dramatic scenario: the cosmological delayed choice experiment. Photons from distant quasars, gravitationally lensed around intervening galaxies, traveling for billions of years before reaching Earth. An astronomer today could choose whether to measure interference or which path information. That choice would determine whether the photon traveled one path or both billions of years ago. This has not been done with quasar light, but smaller scale versions have been performed, and they confirm the predictions. The past is not fixed until it is observed. History is created by the questions we ask. Wheeler took from this a strange and beautiful picture. The universe, he said, is a self-excited circuit. It begins as a foam of potentialities, not yet real. Through billions of years of evolution, it gives rise to observers, and those observers, by asking questions, bring the universe into being retroactively. The universe is the eye that looks back at itself. But Wheeler was always uncomfortable with making this about consciousness. Late in his life, he backed away from any suggestion that human minds are special. The questions, he insisted, can be asked by any physical system. The universe was bringing itself into being long before humans evolved. Stars observed, galaxies observed. Every interaction was a question and an answer. This is where we end up. The experiments have been published. The results have been verified. The theories have been developed and refined. And the picture that emerges is stranger than the popular narrative about consciousness creating reality. Observation does not require consciousness. It does not require a mind. It requires interaction, information transfer, correlation. These happened constantly, everywhere, at every scale. The environment is always watching. Every photon that bounces off an object is asking a question about where the object is. Every air molecule that collides with a particle is asking a question about the particle's state. And if quantum mechanics applies universally, including to the observers themselves, then there is no observer-independent reality. What you observe is real for you. What I observe is real for me. And if our observations conflict, there is no higher court of appeal, no God's eye view that settles the matter. The universe is not a stage on which we watch a play. It is a participatory process, and we are in it, along with every photon and every electron and every grain of dust. Our observations do not reveal pre-existing facts. They participate in creating facts, and those facts are relative to us. This should feel unsettling. It violates our deepest intuitions about what reality is. We want there to be a truth out there, independent of us, waiting to be discovered. We want our observations to be windows onto that truth. Quantum mechanics says otherwise, and the people who proved it would rather not talk about what it means. The universe is not watching you. You are part of how it watches itself. And there is nothing outside the watching, no privileged perspective, no view from nowhere, just perspectives entangled with other perspectives, creating facts that exist relative to the entanglement. The experiments are on the record, the implications are clear, and the silence of the physics community is its own kind of answer. Some truths are too uncomfortable to hold. Some questions are too destabilizing to ask. But the questions have been asked, and the answers are in. You are not an observer of reality. You are one of the ways reality observes itself, and so is everything else.